You're listening to Midwest Coven Cast Presents Weekend Reads. I'm Marilyn of Midwest Coven Cast. Here in Season 3 of Weekend Reads, we will be making our way through the 1922 abridgment of Sir James Frazer's The Golden Bough. You can visit MidwestCovenCast.com to find podcast extras, including a free online copy of the text. Consider supporting Midwest Coven Cast and Weekend Reads on Patreon for access to additional materials, like a serialized official Midwest Coven Cast Presents Weekend Reads ebook with additional notes about the text and some editorial modernizations straight from, well, me. Now, Coven, it is time to cozy up with your coffee or tea and enjoy this episode of Weekend Reads. Chapter 50. Eating the God. Subsection 1. The Sacrament of First Fruits. We have now seen that the corn spirit is represented sometimes in human, sometimes in animal form, and that in both cases he is killed in the person of his representative and eaten sacramentally. To find examples of actually killing the human representative of the corn spirit, we had naturally to go to savage races, but the harvest suppers of our European peasants have furnished unmistakable examples of the sacramental eating of animals as representatives of the corn spirit. But further, as might have been anticipated, the new corn is itself eaten sacramentally, that is, as the body of the corn spirit. In Wormland, Sweden, the farmer's wife uses the grain of the last sheaf to bake a loaf in the shape of a little girl. This loaf is divided amongst the whole household and eaten by them. Here the loaf represents the corn spirit conceived as a maiden. Just as in Scotland, the corn spirit is similarly conceived and represented by the last sheaf made up in the form of a woman and bearing the name of the maiden. As usual, the corn spirit is believed to reside in the last sheaf, and to eat a loaf made from the last sheaf is, therefore, to eat the corn spirit itself. Similarly, at La Paille in France, a man made of dough is hung upon the fir tree, which is carried on the last harvest wagon. The tree and the dough man are taken to the mayor's house and kept there till the vintage is over. Then the close of the harvest is celebrated by a feast at which the mayor breaks the dough man in pieces and gives the pieces to the people to eat. In these examples, the corn spirit is represented and eaten in human shape. In other cases, though the new corn is not baked in loaves of human shape, still the solemn ceremonies with which it is eaten suffice to indicate that it is partaken of sacramentally, that is, as the body of the corn spirit. For example, the following ceremonies used to be observed by Lithuanian peasants at eating the new corn. About the time of the autumn sowing, when all the corn had been got in and the threshing had begun, each farmer held a festival called sabarios, that is, the mixing or throwing together. He took 9 good handfuls of each kind of crop, wheat, barley, oats, flax, beans, lentils, and the rest, and each handful he divided into 3 parts. The 27 portions of each grain were then thrown on a heap, and all mixed up together. The grain used had to be that which was first threshed and winnowed, and which had been set aside and kept for this purpose. A part of the grain thus mixed was employed to bake little loaves, one for each of the household. The rest was mixed with more barley or oats and made into beer. The first beer brewed from this mixture was for the drinking of the farmer, his wife, and children. The second brew was for the servants. The beer being ready, the farmer chose an evening when no stranger was expected. Then he knelt down before the barrel of beer, drew a jugful of the liquor, and poured it on the bung of the barrel, saying, "O fruitful earth, make rye and barley and all kinds of corn to flourish." Next, he took the jug to the parlor, where his wife and children awaited him. On the floor of the parlor lay bound a black or white or speckled, not a red, cock and a hen of the same color, and of the same brood, which must have been hatched within the year. Then the farmer knelt down with the jug in his hand and thanked God for the harvest, and prayed for a good crop next year. Next all lifted up their hands and said, "O God, and thou, O earth, we give you this cock and hen as a free will offering." With that the farmer killed the fowls with the blows of a wooden spoon, for he might not cut their heads off. After the first prayer, and after killing each of the birds, he poured out 1/3 of the beer. Then his wife boiled the fowls in a new pot, which had never been used before. After that, a bushel was set, bottom upwards, on the floor, and on it were placed the little loaves mentioned above, and the boiled fowls. Next, the new beer was fetched, together with a ladle and 3 mugs, none of which was used except on this occasion. When the farmer had ladled the beer into the mugs, the family knelt down round the bushel. The father then uttered a prayer and drank off the 3 mugs of beer. The rest followed this example. Then the loaves and the flesh of the fowls were eaten, after which the beer went round again, till everyone had emptied each of the 3 mugs 9 times. None of the food should remain over, but if anything did happen to be left, it was consumed next morning with the same ceremonies. The bones were given to the dog to eat. If he did not eat them all up, the remains were buried under the dung in the cattle stall. This ceremony was observed at the beginning of December. On the day on which it took place, no bad word might be spoken. Such was the custom about 200 years or more ago. At the present day in Lithuania, when new potatoes or loaves made from the new corn are being eaten, all the people at the table pull each other's hair. The meaning of this last custom is obscure, but a similar custom was certainly observed by the heathen Lithuanians at their solemn sacrifices. Many of the Estonians of the island of Oesel will not eat bread baked of the new corn till they have first taken a bite at a piece of iron. The iron is here plainly a charm, intended to render harmless the spirit that is in the corn. In Sutherlandshire, at the present day, when the new potatoes are dug, all the family must taste them. Otherwise, the spirits in them, the potatoes, take offence, and the potatoes would not keep. In one part of Yorkshire, it is still customary for the clergyman to cut the first corn, and my informant believes that the corn so cut is used to make the communion bread. If the latter part of the custom is correctly reported, and analogy is all in its favor, it shows how the Christian communion has absorbed within itself a sacrament which is doubtless far older than Christianity. The Aino or Ainu of Japan are said to distinguish various kinds of millet as male and female respectively, and these kinds taken together are called the divine husband and wife cereal, umarek haru kamui. Therefore, before millet is pounded and made into cakes for general eating, the old men have a few made for themselves first to worship. When they are ready, they pray to them very earnestly and say, "O thou cereal deity, we worship thee. Thou hast grown very well this year, and thy flavor will be sweet. Thou art good. The goddess of fire will be glad, and we also shall rejoice greatly. O thou God, O thou divine cereal, do thou nourish the people. I now partake of thee. I worship thee and give thee thanks." After having thus prayed, they, the worshippers, take a cake and eat it, and from this time the people may all partake of the new millet. And so, with many gestures of homage and words of prayer, this kind of food is dedicated to the well-being of the Ainu. No doubt the cereal offering is regarded as a tribute paid to a god, but that god is no other than the seed itself, and it is only a god in so far as it is beneficial to the human body. At the close of the rice harvest, in the East Indian island of Bough, each clan meets at a common sacramental meal, to which every member of the clan is bound to contribute a little of the new rice. This meal is called eating the soul of the rice, a name which clearly indicates the sacramental character of the repast. Some of the rice is also set apart and offered to the spirits. Amongst the Alfoors of Manasseh and Celebes, the priest sows the first rice seed and plucks the first ripe rice in each field. This rice he roasts and grinds into meal, and gives some of it to each of the household. Shortly before the rice harvest in Boland, Mongondo, another district of Celebes, an offering is made of a small pig or fowl. Then the priest plucks a little rice, first on his own field and next on those of his neighbors. All the rice thus plucked by him he dries along with his own, and then gives it back to the respective owners, who have it ground and boiled. When it is boiled, the women take it back with an egg to the priest, who offers the egg in sacrifice, and returns the rice to the women. Of this rice, every member of the family, down to the youngest child, must partake. After this ceremony, everyone is free to get in his rice. Amongst the Burghers of Badagas, a tribe of the Nilgiri hills in southern India, the first handful of seed is sown, and the first sheaf reaped by the Kurumbar, a man of a different tribe, the members of which the Burghers regard as sorcerers. The grain contained in the first sheaf is that day reduced to meal, made into cakes, and being offered as a first fruit oblation, is, together with the remainder of the sacrificed animal, partaken of by the Burgher and the whole of his family, as the meat of a federal offering and sacrifice. Among the Hindus of southern India, the eating of the new rice is the occasion of a family festival called Pongal. The new rice is boiled in a new pot on a fire which is kindled at noon on the day when, according to Hindu astrologers, the sun enters the Tropic of Capricorn. The boiling of the pot is watched with great anxiety by the whole family, For as the milk boils, so will the coming year be. If the milk boils rapidly, the year will be prosperous, but it will be the reverse if the milk boils slowly. Some of the new boiled rice is offered to the image of Ganesa, then everyone partakes of it. In some parts of northern India, the festival of the new crop is known as Navan, that is, new grain. When the crop is ripe, the owner takes the omens, goes to the field, plucks 5 or 6 ears of barley in the spring crop, and one of the millets in the autumn harvest. This is brought home, parched, and mixed with coarse sugar, butter, and curds. Some of it is thrown on the fire in the name of the village gods and deceased ancestors. The rest is eaten by the family. The ceremony of eating the new yams at Onitsha on the Niger is thus described. Each headman brought out 6 yams and cut down young branches of palm leaves and placed them before his gate, roasted 3 of the yams, and got some kola nuts and fish. After the yam is roasted, the Libya, or country doctor, takes the yam, scrapes it into a sort of meal, and divides it into halves. He then takes one piece and places it on the lips of the person who is going to eat the new yam. The eater then blows up the steam from the hot yam and afterwards pokes a hole into his mouth and says, "I thank God for being permitted to eat the new yam." He then begins to chew it heartily, with fish likewise. Among the Nandi of British East Africa, when the Eleusine grain is ripening in autumn, every woman who owns a cornfield goes out into it with her daughters, and they all pluck some of the ripe grain. Each of the women then fixes one grain in her necklace and chews another, which she rubs on her forehead, throat, and breasts. No mark of joy escapes them. Sorrowfully, they cut a basketful of the new corn, and carrying it home, place it on the loft to dry. As the ceiling is of wickerwork, a good deal of the grain drops through the crevices and falls into the fire, where it explodes with a crackling noise. The people make no attempt to prevent this waste, for they regard the crackling of the grain in the fire as a sign that the souls of the dead are partaking of it. A few days later, porridge is made from the new grain and served up with milk at the evening meal. All the members of the family take some of the porridge and dab it on the walls and roofs of the huts. Also, they put a little in their mouths and spit it out towards the east and on the outside of the huts. Then, holding up some of the grain in his hand, the head of the family prays to God for health and strength, and likewise for milk, and everybody present repeats the words of the prayer after him. Amongst the Kafirs of Natal and Zululand, no one may eat of the new fruits till after a festival, which marks the beginning of the Kafir year, and falls at the end of December or the beginning of January. All the people assemble at the king's kraal, where they feast and dance. Before they separate, the dedication of the people takes place. Various fruits of the earth, as corn, mealies, and pumpkins, mixed with the flesh of a sacrificed animal, and with medicine, are boiled in great pots, and a little of this food is placed in each man's mouth by the king himself. After thus partaking of the sanctified fruits, a man is himself sanctified for the whole year, and may immediately get in his crops. It is believed that if any man were to partake of the new fruits before the festival, he would die. If he were detected, he would be put to death, or at least all his cattle would be taken from him. The holiness of the new fruits is well marked by the rule that they must be cooked in a special pot, which is used only for the purpose, and on a new fire kindled by a magician through the friction of 2 sticks, which are called husband and wife. Among the Bechuanas, it is a rule that before they partake of the new crops, they must purify themselves. The purification takes place at the commencement of the new year on a day in January, which is fixed by the chief. It begins in the great kraal of the tribe, where all the adult males assemble. Each of them takes in his hand leaves of a gourd called by the natives larotes, described as something between a pumpkin and a vegetable marrow, and having crushed the leaves, he anoints with the expressed juice his big toes and his navel. Many people, indeed, apply the juice to all the joints of their body, but the better informed say that this is a vulgar departure from ancient custom. After this ceremony, in the great kraal, every man goes home to his own kraal, assembles all the members of his family, men, women, and children, and smears them all with the juice of the larotes leaves. Some of the leaves are also pounded, mixed with milk in a large wooden dish, and given to the dogs to lap up. Then the porridge plate of each member of the family is rubbed with the larotes leaves. When this purification has been completed, but not before, the people are free to eat of the new crops. The Bororo Indians of Brazil think that it would be certain death to eat the new maize before it has been blessed by the medicine man. The ceremony of blessing, it is as follows. The half-ripe husk is washed and placed before the medicine man, who by dancing and singing for several hours, and by incessant smoking, works himself up into a state of ecstasy, whereupon he bites into the husk, trembling in every limb and uttering shrieks from time to time. A similar ceremony is performed whenever a large animal or a large fish is killed. The Bororo are firmly persuaded that were any man to touch unconsecrated maize or meat before the ceremony had been completed, he and his whole tribe would perish. Amongst the Creek Indians of North America, the busk, or festival of first fruits, was the chief ceremony of the year. It was held in July or August, when the corn was ripe, and marked the end of the old year and the beginning of the new one. Before it took place, none of the Indians would eat or even handle any part of the new harvest. Sometimes each town had its own busk. Sometimes several towns united to hold one in common. Before celebrating the busk, the people provided themselves new clothes and new household utensils and furniture. They collected their old clothes and rubbish together with all the remaining grain and other old provisions, cast them together in one common heap, and consumed them with fire. As a preparation for the ceremony, all the fires in the village were extinguished, and the ashes swept clean away. In particular, the hearth or altar of the temple was dug up and the ashes carried out. Then the chief priest put some roots of the button snake plant, with some green tobacco leaves and a little of the new fruits, at the bottom of the fireplace, which he afterwards commanded to be covered up with white clay and wetted over with clean water. A thick arbor of green branches of young trees was then made over the altar. Meanwhile, the women at home were cleaning out their houses, renewing the old hearths, and scouring all the cooking vessels, that they might be ready to receive the new fire and the new fruits. The public or sacred square was carefully swept of even the smallest crumbs of previous feasts, for fear of polluting the first fruit offerings. Also, every vessel that had contained or had been used about any food during the expiring year was removed from the temple before sunset. Then all the men who were not known to have violated the law of the first fruit offering and that of marriage during the year were summoned by a crier to enter the holy square and observe a solemn fast. But the women, except 6 old ones, the children, and all who had not attained the rank of warriors, were forbidden to enter the square. Sentinels were also posted at the corners of the square to keep out all persons deemed impure and all animals. A strict fast was then observed for 2 nights and a day, the devotees drinking a bitter decoction of button snake root in order to vomit and purge their sinful bodies. That the people outside the square might also be purified, one of the old men laid down a quantity of green tobacco at a corner of the square. This was carried off by an old woman and distributed to the people without, who chewed and swallowed it in order to afflict their souls. During this general fast, the women, children, and men of weak constitution were allowed to eat after midday, but not before. On the morning when the fast ended, the women brought a quantity of old year's food to the outside of the sacred square. These provisions were then fetched in and set before the famished multitude, but all traces of them had to be removed before noon. When the sun was declining from the meridian, all the people were commanded by the voice of a crier to stay within doors, to do no bad act, and to be sure to extinguish and throw away every spark of the old fire. Universal silence now reigned. Then the high priest made the new fire by the friction of 2 pieces of wood, and placed it on the altar under the green arbor. This new fire was believed to atone for all past crimes except murder. Next, a basket of new fruits was brought. The high priest took out a little of each sort of fruit, rubbed it with bear's oil, and offered it, together with some flesh, to the bountiful Holy Spirit of fire, as a first fruit offering, and an annual oblation for sin. He also consecrated the sacred emetics, the button snake root and the cassina, or black drink, by pouring a little of them into the fire. The persons who had remained outside now approached without entering the sacred square, and the chief priest thereupon made a speech exhorting the people to observe their old rites and customs, announcing that the new divine fire had purged away the sins of the past year, and earnestly warning the women that if any of them had not extinguished the old fire, or had contracted any impurity, they must forthwith depart, lest the divine fire should spoil both them and the people. Some of the new fire was then set down outside the holy square. The women carried it home joyfully, and laid it upon their unpolluted hearths. When several towns had united to celebrate the festival, the new fire might thus be carried for several miles. The new fruits were then dressed on the new fires and eaten with bear's oil, which was deemed indispensable. At one point of the festival, the men rubbed the new corn between their hands, then on their faces and breasts. During the festival which followed, the warriors, dressed in their wild martial array, their heads covered with white down, and carrying white feathers in their hands, danced around the sacred arbor, under which burned the new fire. The ceremonies lasted 8 days, during which the strictest continence was practiced. Towards the conclusion of the festival, the warriors fought a mock battle. Then the men and women together, in 3 circles, danced round the sacred fire. Lastly, all the people smeared themselves with white clay and bathed in running water. They came out of the water believing that no evil could now befall them for what they had done amiss in the past. So they departed in joy and peace. To this day, also, the remnant of the Seminole Indians of Florida, a people of the same stock as the Creeks, hold an annual purification and festival called the Green Corn Dance, at which the new corn is eaten. On the evening of the first day of the festival, they quaff a nauseous black drink, as it is called, which acts both as an emetic and purgative. They believe that he who does not drink of this liquor cannot safely eat the new green corn, and besides that he will be sick at some time in the year. While the liquor is being drunk, the dancing begins, and the medicine men join in it. Next day, they eat of the green corn. The following day, they fast, probably from fear of polluting the sacred food in their stomachs by contact with common food. But the 3rd day, they hold a great feast. Even tribes which do not till the ground sometimes observe analogous ceremonies, when they gather the first wild fruits or dig the first roots of the season. Thus, among the Salish and the Tenay Indians of Northwest America, before the young people eat the first berries or roots of the season, they always addressed the fruit or plant and begged for its favor and aid. In some tribes, regular first fruit ceremonies were annually held at the time of picking, and the wild fruit, and also among the salmon-eating tribes, when the run of the sockeye salmon began. These ceremonies were not so much thanksgivings as performances to ensure a plentiful crop or supply of the particular object desired, for if they were not properly and reverently carried out, there was danger of giving offense to the spirits of the objects and being deprived of them. For example, these Indians are fond of the young shoots or suckers of the wild raspberry, and they observe a solemn ceremony at eating the first of them in season. The shoots are cooked in a new pot. The people assemble and stand in a great circle with closed eyes, while the presiding chief or medicine man invokes the spirit of the plant, begging that it will be propitious to them and grant them a good supply of suckers. After this part of the ceremony is over, the cooked suckers are handed to the presiding officer in a newly carved dish, and a small portion is given to each person present, who reverently and decorously eats it. The Thompson Indians of British Columbia cook and eat the sunflower root, Balsamorza sagittata, nut, but they used to regard it as a mysterious being, and observed a number of taboos in connection with it. For example, women who were engaged in digging or cooking the root must practice continence, and no man might come near the oven where the women are baking the root. When young people ate the first berries, roots, or other products of the season, they addressed a prayer to the sunflower root as follows: I inform thee that I intend to eat thee. Mayest thou always help me to ascend, so that I may always be able to reach the tops of mountains, and may I never be clumsy. I ask this from thee, sunflower root. Thou art the greatest of all in mystery. To omit this prayer would make the eater lazy, and cause him to sleep long in the morning. These customs of the Thompson and other Indian tribes of Northwest America are instructive, because they clearly indicate the motive, or at least one of the motives, which underlies the ceremonies observed at eating the first fruits of the season. That motive, in the case of these Indians, is simply a belief that the plant itself is animated by a conscious and more or less powerful spirit, who must be propitiated before the people can safely partake of the fruits or roots, which are supposed to be part of his body. Now, if this is true of wild fruits and roots, we may infer with some probability that it is also true of cultivated fruits and roots, such as yams, and in particular that it holds good of the cereals, such as wheat, barley, oats, rice, and maize. In all cases, it seems reasonable to infer that the scruples which savages manifest at eating the first fruits of any crop, and the ceremonies which they observe before they overcome their scruples, are due, at least in large measure, to the notion that the plant or tree is animated by a spirit, or even a deity, whose leave must be obtained, or whose favor must be sought, before it is possible to partake with safety of the new crop. This indeed is plainly affirmed of the Aino. They call the millet the divine cereal, the cereal deity, and they pray to and worship him before they will eat of the cakes made from the new millet. And even where the indwelling divinity of the first fruits is not expressly affirmed, it appears to be implied both by the solemn preparations made for eating them, and by the dangers supposed to be incurred by persons who venture to partake of them without observing the prescribed ritual. In all such cases, accordingly, we may not improperly describe the eating of the new fruits as a sacrament or communion with a deity, or at all events with a powerful spirit. Among the usages which point to this conclusion are the custom of employing either new or specially reserved vessels to hold new fruits, and the practice of purifying the persons of the communicants before it is lawful to engage in the solemn act of communion with the divinity. Of all the modes of purification adopted on these occasions, none perhaps brings out the sacramental virtue of the rite so clearly as the Creek and Seminole practice of taking a purgative before swallowing the new corn. The intention is thereby to prevent the sacred food from being polluted by contact with common food in the stomach of the eater. For the same reason, Catholics partake of the Eucharist fasting, and among the pastoral Maasai of eastern Africa, the young warriors, who live on meat and milk exclusively, are obliged to eat nothing but milk for so many days, and then nothing but meat for so many more. And before they pass from the one food to the other, they must make sure that none of the old food remains in their stomachs. This they do by swallowing a very powerful purgative and emetic. In some of the festivals which we have examined, the sacrament of first fruits is combined with a sacrifice or presentation of them to gods or spirits, and in course of time the sacrifice of first fruits tends to throw the sacrament into the shade, if not to supersede it. The mere fact of offering the first fruits to the gods or spirits comes now to be thought a sufficient preparation for eating the new corn. The higher powers having received their share, man is free to enjoy the rest. This mode of viewing the new fruits implies that they are regarded no longer as themselves instinct with divine life, but merely as a gift bestowed by the gods upon man, who is bound to express his gratitude and homage to his divine benefactors by returning to them a portion of their bounty. Subsection 2. Eating the god among the Aztecs. The custom of eating bread sacramentally as the body of a god was practiced by the Aztecs before the discovery and conquest of Mexico by the Spaniards. Twice a year, in May and December, an image of the great Mexican god, Huitzilopochtli or Huitzilopochtli, was made of dough, then broken in pieces and solemnly eaten by his worshippers. The May ceremony is thus described by the historian Acosta. The Mexicans, in the month of May, made their principal feast to their god Huitzilopochtli, and 2 days before the feast, the virgins whereof I have spoken, the which were shut up and secluded in the same temple, and were, as it were, religious women, did mingle a quantity of the seed of beets with roasted maize, and then they did mold it with honey, making an idol of that paste in bigness, like to that of wood, putting instead of eyes grains of green glass, or blue or white, and for teeth grains of maize, set forth with all the ornament and furniture that I have said. This being finished, all the noblemen came and brought it to an exquisite and rich garment, like unto that of the idol wherewith they did attire it. Being thus clad and decked, they did set it in an azured chair and in a litter to carry it on their shoulders. The morning of this feast being come, an hour before day, all the maidens came forth attired in white, with new ornaments, the which that day were called the sisters of their god Huitzilopochtli. They came crowned with garlands of maize, roasted and parched, being like unto azar, or the flower of orange, and about their necks they had great chains of the same, which went baldric-wise under the left arm. Their cheeks were dyed with vermilion. Their arms from the elbow to the wrist were covered with red parrot's feathers. Young men dressed in red robes, and crowned like the virgins with maize, then carried the idol in its litter to the foot of the great pyramid-shaped temple, by the steep and narrow steps of which it was drawn to the music of flutes, trumpets, cornets, and drums. While they mounted up the idol, all the people stood in the court with much reverence and fear. Being mounted to the top, and that they had placed it in a little lodge of roses, which they held readily. Presently came the young men, which strewed many flowers of sundry kinds, wherewith they filled the temple both within and without. This done, all the virgins came out of their convent, bringing pieces of paste compounded of beets and roasted maize, which was of the same paste, whereof their idol was made and compounded, and they were of the fashion of great bones. They delivered them to the young men, who carried them up and laid them at the idol's feet, wherewith they filled the whole place, that it could receive no more. They called these morsels of paste and bones of Vitzlaputzli. Having laid abroad these bones, presently came all the ancients of the temple, priests, Levites, and all the rest of the ministers, according to their dignities and antiquities. For herein there was a strict order amongst them, one after another, with their veils of diverse colors and works, every one according to his dignity and office, having garlands upon their heads and chains of flowers about their necks. After them came their gods and goddesses, whom they worshipped of diverse figures, attired in the same livery. Then, putting themselves in order about those morsels and pieces of paste, they used certain ceremonies, with singing and dancing, by means whereof they were blessed and consecrated for the flesh and bones of this idol. This ceremony and blessing, whereby they were taken for the flesh and bones of the idol, being ended, they honored those pieces in the same sort as their god. All the city came to this godly spectacle, and there was a commandment, very strictly observed throughout all the land, that the day of the feast of the idol of Vitzlaputzli they should eat no other meat but this paste, with honey, whereof the idol was made. And this should be eaten at the point of day, and they should drink no water, nor any other thing, till afternoon. They held it for an ill sign, yea, for sacrilege, to do the contrary. But after the ceremonies ended, it was lawful for them to eat anything. During the time of this ceremony, they hid the water from their little children, admonishing all such as had the use of reason not to drink any water, which if they did, the anger of God would come upon them, and they should die, which they did observe very carefully and strictly. The ceremonies, dancing, and sacrifice ended, the went to unclothe themselves, and the priests and superiors of the temple took the idol of paste, which they spoiled of all the ornaments it had, and made many pieces, as well of the idol itself as the truncheons, which they consecrated, and then they gave them to the people in manner of a communion, beginning with the greater and continuing unto the rest, both men and women and little children, who received it with such tears, fear, and reverence, as it was an admirable thing, saying that they did eat the flesh and bones of God, wherewith they were grieved, such as had any sick folks demanded thereof for them, and carried it with great reverence and veneration. From this interesting passage, we learn that the ancient Mexicans, even before the arrival of Christian missionaries, were fully acquainted with the doctrine of transubstantiation, and acted upon it in the solemn rites of their religion. They believed that by consecrating bread, their priests could turn it into the very body of their god, so that all who thereupon partook of the consecrated bread entered into a mystic communion with the deity by receiving a portion of his divine substance into themselves. The doctrine of transubstantiation, or the magical conversion of bread into flesh, was also familiar to the Aryans of ancient India, long before the spread and even the rise of Christianity. The Brahmins taught that the rice cakes offered in sacrifice were substitutes for human beings, and that they were actually converted into the real bodies of men by the manipulation of the priest. We read that when it, the rice cake, still consists of rice meal, it is the hair. When he pours water on it, it becomes skin. When he mixes it, it becomes flesh, for then it becomes consistent, and consistent also is the flesh. When it is baked, it becomes bone, for then it becomes somewhat hard, and hard is the bone. And when he is about to take it off the fire and sprinkles it with butter, he changes it into marrow. This is the completeness which they call the fivefold animal sacrifice. Now, too, we can perfectly understand why on the day of their solemn communion with the deity, the Mexicans refused to eat any other food than the consecrated bread which they revered as the very flesh and bones of their god, and why up till noon they might drink nothing at all, not even water. They feared, no doubt, to defile the portion of God in their stomachs by contact with common things. A similar pious fear led the Creek and Seminole Indians, as we saw, to adopt the more thoroughgoing expedient of rinsing out their bodies by a strong purgative before they dared to partake of the sacrament of first fruits. At the festival of the winter solstice in December, the Aztecs killed their god, Huitzilopochtli, in effigy first and ate him afterwards. As a preparation for this solemn ceremony, an image of the deity in the likeness of a man was fashioned out of seeds of various sorts, which were kneaded into a dough with the blood of children. The bones of the god were represented by pieces of acacia wood. This image was placed on the chief altar of the temple, and on the day of the festival the king offered incense to it. Early next day it was taken down and set on its feet in a great hall. Then a priest, who bore the name and acted the part of the god Quetzalcoatl, took a flint-tipped dart and hurled it into the breast of the dough image, piercing it through and through. This was called killing the god Huitzilopochtli, so that his body might be eaten. One of the priests cut out the heart of the image and gave it to the king to eat. The rest of the image was divided into minute pieces, of which every man, great and small, down to the male children in the cradle, received one to eat. But no woman might taste a morsel. The ceremony was called Teoqualo, that is, God is eaten. At another festival, the Mexicans made little images like men, which stood for the cloud-capped mountains. These images were molded of a paste of various seeds, and were dressed in paper ornaments. Some people fashioned 5, others 10, others as many as 15 of them. Having been made, they were placed in the oratory of each house and worshipped. 4 times in the course of the night, offerings of food were brought to them in tiny vessels, and people sang and played the flute before them through all the hours of darkness. At break of day, the priests stabbed the images with a weaver's instrument, cut off their heads, and tore out their hearts, which they presented to the master of the house on a green saucer. The bodies of the images were then eaten by all the family, especially by the servants, in order that by eating them they might be preserved from certain distempers to which those persons who were negligent of worship to those deities conceived themselves to be subject. Subsection 3. Mini Mani in Aricia. We are now able to suggest an explanation of the proverb, "There are many mani at Aricia." Certain loaves made in the shape of men were called by the Romans mania, and it appears that this kind of loaf was especially made at Aricia. Now, Mania, the name of one of these loaves, was also the name of the mother or grandmother of ghosts, to whom woolen effigies of men and women were dedicated at the festival of the Compitalia. These effigies were hung at the doors of all the houses in Rome. One effigy was hung up for every free person in the house, and one effigy of a different kind for every slave. The reason was that on this day the ghosts of the dead were believed to be going about, and it was hoped that either out of good nature or through simple inadvertence they would carry off the effigies at the door instead of the living people in the house. According to tradition, these woolen figures were substitutes for a former custom of sacrificing human beings. Upon data so fragmentary and uncertain, it is impossible to build with confidence, but it seems worth suggesting that the loaves in human form, which appear to have been baked at Aricia, were sacramental bread, and that in the old days, when the divine king of the wood was annually slain, loaves were made in his image, like the paste figures of the gods in Mexico, and were eaten sacramentally by his worshippers. The Mexican sacraments in honor of Huitzilopochtli were also accompanied by the sacrifice of human victims. The tradition that the founder of the sacred grove at Aricia was a man named Manius, from whom many mani were descended, would thus be an etymological myth invented to explain the name Manea, as applied to the sacramental loaves. A dim recollection of the original connection of the loaves with human sacrifices may perhaps be traced in the story that the effigies dedicated to Mania at the Compitalia were substitutes for human victims. The story itself, however, is probably devoid of foundation, since the practice of putting up dummies to divert the attention of ghosts or demons from living people is not uncommon. For example, the Tibetans stand in fear of innumerable earth demons, all of whom are under the authority of Old Mother Kon Ma. This goddess, who may be compared to the Roman Mania, the mother or grandmother of ghosts, is dressed in golden yellow robes, holds a golden noose in her hand, and rides on a ram, in order to bar the dwelling house against the foul fiends, of whom Old Mother Kon Ma is mistress. An elaborate structure, somewhat resembling a chandelier, is fixed above the door on the outside of the house. It contains a ram's skull, a variety of precious objects such as gold leaf, silver, and turquoise, also some dry food such as rice, wheat, and pulse, and finally images or pictures of a man, a woman, and a house. The object of these figures of a man, wife, and house is to deceive the demons, should they still come in spite of this offering, and to mislead them into the belief that the foregoing pictures are the inmates of the house, so that they may wreak their wrath on these bits of wood, and to save the real human occupants. When all is ready, a priest prays to Old Mother Kon Ma that she would be pleased to accept these dainty offerings and to close the open doors of the earth in order that the demons may not come forth to infest and injure the household. Again, effigies are often employed as a means of preventing or curing sickness. The demons of disease either mistake the effigies for living people or are persuaded or compelled to enter them, leaving the real men and women well and whole. Thus, the Alfours of Manassa and Celebes will sometimes transport a sick man to another house, while they leave on his bed a dummy made up of a pillow and clothes. This dummy the demon is supposed to mistake for the sick man, who consequently recovers. Cure or prevention of this sort seems to find special favor with the natives of Borneo. Thus, when an epidemic is raging among them, the Dayaks of the Katuenga River set up wooden images at their doors in the hope that the demons of the plague may be deluded into carrying off the effigies instead of the people. Among the Olo Ngaju of Borneo, when a sick man is supposed to be suffering from the assaults of a ghost, puppets of dough or rice meal are made and thrown under the house as substitutes for the patient, who thus rids himself of the ghost. In certain of the western districts of Borneo, if a man is taken suddenly and violently sick, the physician, who in this part of the world is generally an old woman, fashions a wooden image and brings it 7 times into contact with the sufferer's head, while she says, "This image serves to take the place of the sick man. Sickness, pass over into the image." Then, with some rice, salt, and tobacco in a little basket, the substitute is carried to the spot where the evil spirit is supposed to have entered the man. There it is set upright on the ground, after the physician has invoked the spirit as follows: "O devil, here is an image which stands instead of the sick man. Release the soul of the sick man and plague the image, for it is indeed prettier and better than he." Batak magicians can conjure the demon of disease out of the patient's body into an image made out of a banana tree with a human face and wrapped up in magic herbs. The image is then hurriedly removed and thrown away or buried beyond the boundaries of the village. Sometimes the image, dressed as a man or a woman according to the sex of the patient, is deposited at a cross-border or other thoroughfare, in the hope that some passer-by, seeing it, may start and cry out, "Ah, so-and-so is dead," for such an exclamation is supposed to delude the demon of disease into a belief that he has accomplished his fell purpose. So he takes himself off and leaves the sufferer to get well. The May Darat, a Sakai tribe of the Malay Peninsula, attribute all kinds of diseases to the agency of spirits, which they call Nayani. Fortunately, however, the magician can induce these maleficent beings to come out of the sick person and take up their abode in rude figures of grass, which are hung up outside the houses in little bell-shaped shrines decorated with peeled sticks. During an epidemic of smallpox, the Yu people will sometimes clear a space outside of the town where they erect a number of low mounds and cover them with as many clay figures as there are people in the place. Pots of food and water are also set out for the refreshment of the spirit of smallpox, who, it is hoped, will take the clay figures and spare the living folk. And to make assurance doubly sure, the road into the town is barricaded against him. With these examples before us, we may surmise that the woolen effigies, which at the festival of the Compitalia might be seen hanging at the doors of all the houses in ancient Rome, were not substitutes for human victims who had formerly been sacrificed at this season, but rather vicarious offerings presented to the mother or grandmother of ghosts, in the hope that on her rounds through the city she would accept or mistake the effigies for the inmates of the house, and so spare the living for another year. It is possible that the puppets made of rushes, which in the month of May the pontiffs and Vestal virgins annually threw into the Tiber from the old Sublician bridge at Rome, had originally the same significance. That is, they may have been designed to purge the city from demonic influence by diverting the attention of the demons from the human beings to the puppets, and then toppling the whole uncanny crew neck and crop into the river, which would soon sweep them far out to sea. In precisely the same way, the natives of Old Calabar used periodically to rid their town of the devils which infested it by luring the unwary demons into a number of lamentable scarecrows, which they afterwards flung into the river. This interpretation of the Roman custom is supported to some extent by the evidence of Plutarch, who speaks of the ceremony as the greatest of purifications. Chapter 51. Homeopathic Magic of a Flesh Diet. The practice of killing a god has now been traced amongst peoples who have reached the agricultural stage of society. We have seen that the spirit of the corn or of other cultivated plants is commonly represented either in human or in animal form, and that in some places a custom has prevailed of killing annually either the human or the animal representative of the god. One reason for thus killing the corn spirit in the person of his representative has been given implicitly in an earlier part of this work. We may suppose that the intention was to guard him or her, for the corn spirit is often feminine, from the enfeeblement of old age by transferring the spirit, while still hale and hearty, to the person of a youthful and vigorous successor. Apart from the desirability of renewing his divine energies, the death of the corn spirit may have been deemed inevitable under the sickles or the knives of the reapers, and his worshippers may accordingly have felt bound to acquiesce in the sad necessity. But further, we have found a widespread custom of eating the god sacramentally, either in the shape of the man or animal who represents the god, or in the shape of bread made in human or animal form. The reasons for thus partaking of the body of the god are, from the primitive standpoint, simple enough. The savage commonly believes that by eating the flesh of an animal or man, he acquires not only the physical, but even the moral and intellectual qualities which were characteristic of that animal or man. So, when the creature is deemed divine, our simple savage naturally expects to absorb a portion of its divinity along with its material substance. It may be well to illustrate by instances this common faith in the acquisition of virtues or vices of many kinds through the medium of animal food, even when there is no pretense that the viands consist of the body or blood of a god. The doctrine forms part of the widely ramified system of sympathetic or homeopathic magic. Thus, for example, the Creeks, Cherokee, and kindred tribes of North American Indians believe that nature is possessed of such a property as to transfuse into men and animals the qualities either of the food they use or of those objects that are presented to their senses. He who feeds on venison is, according to their physical system, swifter and more sagacious than the man who lives on the flesh of the clumsy bear or helpless dunghill fowls, the slow-footed tame cattle, or the heavy wallowing swine. This is the reason that several of their old men recommend and say that formerly their greatest chieftains observed a constant rule in their diet, and seldom ate of any animal of a gross quality or heavy motion of body, fancying it conveyed a dullness through the whole system, and disabled them from exerting themselves with proper vigor in their martial, civil, and religious duties. The Zaparo Indians of Ecuador will, unless from necessity in most cases, not eat any heavy meats, such as tapir and peccary, but confine themselves to birds, monkeys, deer, fish, etc., principally because they argue that the heavier meats make them unwieldy, like the animals who supply the flesh, impeding their agility and unfitting them for the chase. Similarly, some of the Brazilian Indians would eat no beast, bird, or fish that ran, flew, or swam slowly, lest by partaking of its flesh they should lose their ability and be unable to escape from their enemies. The Caribs abstained from the flesh of pigs, lest it should cause them to have small eyes like pigs, and they refused to partake of tortoises, from fear that if they did so, they would become heavy and stupid like the animal. Among the Fans of West Africa, men in the prime of their life never eat tortoises for a similar reason. They imagine that if they did so, their vigor and fleetness of foot would be gone. But old men may eat tortoises freely, because having already lost the power of running, they can take no harm from the flesh of the slow-footed creature. While many savages thus fear to eat the flesh of slow-footed animals, lest they should themselves become slow-footed, the Bushmen of South Africa purposely ate the flesh of such creatures, and the reason which they gave for doing so exhibits a curious refinement of savage philosophy. They imagined that the game which they pursued would be influenced sympathetically by the food in the body of the hunter, so that if he had eaten of swift-footed animals, the quarry would be swift-footed also, and would escape him, whereas if he had eaten of slow-footed animals, the quarry would also be slow-footed, and he would be able to overtake and kill it. For that reason, hunters of gemsbok particularly avoided eating the flesh of the swift and agile springbok. Indeed, they would not even touch it with their hands, because they believed the springbok to be a very lively creature, which did not go to sleep at night, and they thought that if they ate springbok, the gemsbok, which they hunted, would likewise not be willing to go to sleep even at night. How then could they catch it? The Namaquas abstain from eating the flesh of hares because they think it would make them faint-hearted as a hare. But they eat the flesh of the lion, or drink the blood of the leopard or lion, to get the courage and strength of these beasts. The Bushmen will not give their children a jackal's heart to eat, lest it should make them timid like the jackal. But they give them a leopard's heart to eat, to make them brave like the leopard. When a Wagogo man of East Africa kills a lion, he eats the heart in order to become brave like a lion, but he thinks that to eat the heart of a hen would make him timid. When a serious disease has attacked a Zulu kraal, the medicine man takes the bone of a very old dog, or the bone of an old cow, bull, or other very old animal, and administers it to the healthy as well as the sick people, in order that they may live to be as old as the animal of whose bone they have partaken. So to restore the aged Aeson to youth, the witch Medea infused into his veins a decoction of the liver of the long-lived deer, and the head of a crow that had outlived 9 generations of men. Among the Dyaks of northwest Borneo, young men and warriors may not eat venison, because it would make them as timid as a deer. But the women and very old men are free to eat it. However, among the Kayans of the same region, who share the same view as to the ill effect of eating venison, men will partake of the dangerous viand, provided it is cooked in the open air, for then the timid spirit of the animal is supposed to escape at once into the jungle, and not to enter into the eater. The Ayano believe that the heart of the water ousel is exceedingly wise, and that in speech the bird is most eloquent. Therefore, whenever he is killed, he should be at once torn open, and his heart wrenched out and swallowed before it has time to grow cold or suffer damage of any kind. If a man swallows it thus, he will become very fluent and wise, and will be able to argue down all his adversaries. In northern India, people fancy that if you eat the eyeballs of an owl, you will be able, like an owl, to see in the dark. When the Kansas Indians were going to war, a feast used to be held in the chief's hut, and the principal dish was dog's flesh, because, said the old Indians, the animal who is so brave that he will let himself be cut in pieces in defense of his master must needs inspire valor. Men of the Bough and the Aru Islands, East Indies, eat the flesh of dogs in order to be bold and nimble in war. Amongst the Papuans of the Port Moresby and the Matu districts, New Guinea, young lads eat strong pig, wallaby, and large fish in order to acquire the strength of the animal or fish. Some of the natives of northern Australia fancy that by eating the flesh of the kangaroo or emu, they are enabled to jump or run faster than before. The Miris of Assam prize tiger's flesh as food for men. It gives them strength and courage, but it is not suited for women. It would make them too strong-minded. In Korea, the bones of tigers fetch a higher price than those of leopards as a means of inspiring courage. A Chinaman in Seoul bought and ate a whole tiger to make himself brave and fierce. In Norse legend, Ingild, son of King Onund, was timid in his youth, but after eating the heart of a wolf, he became very bold. He also gained strength and courage by eating the heart of a bear and drinking its blood. In Morocco, lethargic patients are given ants to swallow, and to eat lion's flesh will make a coward brave. But people abstain from eating the hearts of fowls, lest thereby they should be rendered timid. When a child is late in learning to speak, the Turks of Central Asia will give it the tongues of certain birds to eat. A North American Indian thought that brandy must be a decoction of hearts and tongues, because, said he, after drinking it I fear nothing, and I talk wonderfully. In Java, there is a tiny earthworm, which now and then utters a shrill sound like that of the alarum of a small clock. Hence, when a public dancing girl has screamed herself hoarse in the exercise of her calling, the leader of the troupe makes her eat some of these worms, in the belief that thus she will regain her voice, and will, after swallowing them, be able to scream as shrilly as ever. The people of Darfur in Central Africa think that the liver is the seat of the soul, and that a man may enlarge his soul by eating the liver of an animal. Whenever an animal is killed, its liver is taken out and eaten, but the people are most careful not to touch it with their hands, as it is considered sacred. It is cut up in small pieces and eaten raw, the bits being conveyed to the mouth on the point of a knife or the sharp point of a stick. Anyone who may accidentally touch the liver is strictly forbidden to partake of it, which prohibition is regarded as a great misfortune for him. Women are not allowed to eat liver because they have no soul. Again, the flesh and blood of dead men are commonly eaten and drunk to inspire bravery, wisdom, or other qualities for which the men themselves were remarkable, or which are supposed to have their special seat in the particular part eaten. Thus, among the mountain tribes of southeastern Africa, there are ceremonies by which the youths are formed into guilds or lodges, and among the rites of initiation, there is one which is intended to infuse courage, intelligence, and other qualities into the novices. Whenever an enemy who has behaved with conspicuous bravery is killed, his liver, which is considered the seat of valor, his ears, which are supposed to be the seat of intelligence, the skin of his forehead, which is regarded as the seat of perseverance, his testicles, which are held to be the seat of strength, and other members, which are viewed as the seat of other virtues, are cut from his body and baked to cinders. The ashes are carefully kept in the horn of a bull, and during the ceremonies observed at circumcision are mixed with other ingredients into a kind of paste, which is administered by the tribal priest to the youths. By this means, the strength, valor, intelligence, and other virtues of the slain are believed to be imparted to the eaters. When Basutos of the mountains have killed a very brave foe, they immediately cut out his heart and eat it, because this is supposed to give them his courage and strength in battle. When Sir Charles McCarthy was killed by the Ashantis in 1824, it is said that his heart was devoured by the chiefs of the Ashanti army, who hoped by this means to imbibe his courage. His flesh was dried and parceled out among the lower officers for the same purpose, and his bones were long kept at Kumasi as national fetishes. The Naurus Indians of New Granada ate the hearts of Spaniards when they had the opportunity, hoping thereby to make themselves as dauntless as the dreaded Castilian chivalry. The Sioux Indians used to reduce to powder the heart of a valiant enemy and swallow the powder, hoping thus to appropriate the dead man's valor. But while the human heart is thus commonly eaten for the sake of imbuing the eater with the qualities of its original owner, it is not, as we have already seen, the only part of the body which is consumed for this purpose. Thus, warriors of Theodora and Ngarigo tribes of southeastern Australia used to eat the hands and feet of their slain enemies, believing that in this way they acquired some of the qualities and courage of the dead. The Kamilaroi of New South Wales ate the liver as well as the heart of a brave man to get his courage. In Tonquin, also, there is a popular superstition that the liver of a brave man makes brave any who partake of it. With a like intent, the Chinese swallow the bile of notorious bandits who have been executed. The Dayaks of Sarawak used to eat the palms of the hands and the flesh of the knees of the slain in order to steady their own hands and strengthen their own knees. The Tololaki, notorious headhunters of Central Celebes, drink the blood and eat the brains of their victims that they may become brave. The Italones of the Philippine Islands drink the blood of their slain enemies and eat part of the back of their heads and of their entrails raw to acquire their courage. For the same reason, the Efagaos, another tribe of the Philippines, suck the brains of their foes. In like manner, the Kai of German New Guinea eat the brains of the enemies they kill in order to acquire their strength. Among the Kimbunda of Western Africa, when a new king succeeds to the throne, a brave prisoner of war is killed in order that the king and nobles may eat his flesh, and so acquire his strength and courage. The notorious Zulu chief, Matuana, drank the gall of 30 chiefs whose people he had destroyed, in the belief that it would make him strong. It is a Zulu fancy that by eating the center of the forehead and the eyebrow of an enemy, they acquire the power of looking steadfastly at a foe. Before every warlike expedition, the people of Manasseh and Celebes used to take the locks of hair of a slain foe and dabble them in boiling water to extract the courage. This infusion of bravery was then drunk by the warriors. In New Zealand, the chief was an Atua, god, but there were powerful and powerless gods. Each naturally sought to make himself one of the former. The plan, therefore, adopted was to incorporate the spirits of others with their own. Thus, when a warrior slew a chief, he immediately gouged out his eyes and swallowed them, the Atua, Tonga, or divinity, being supposed to reside in that organ. Thus, he not only killed the body, but also possessed himself of the soul of his enemy, and consequently, the more chiefs he slew, the greater did his divinity become. It is now easy to understand why a savage should desire to partake of the flesh of an animal or man whom he regards as divine. By eating the body of the god, he shares in the god's attributes and powers. And when the god is a corn god, the corn is his proper body. When he is a vine god, the juice of the grape is his blood. And so by eating the bread and drinking the wine, the worshipper partakes of the real body and blood of his god. Thus, the drinking of wine, in the rites of a vine god like Dionysus, is not an act of revelry. It is a solemn sacrament. Yet a time comes when reasonable men find it hard to understand how anyone in his senses can suppose that by eating bread and drinking wine, he consumes the body or blood of a deity. When we call corn Ceres and wine Bacchus, says Cicero, we use a common figure of speech. But do you imagine that anybody is so insane as to believe that the thing he feeds upon is a god? Chapter 52. Killing the divine animal. Subsection 1. Killing the sacred buzzard. In the preceding chapters, we saw that many communities, which have progressed so far as to subsist mainly by agriculture, have been in the habit of killing and eating their farinaceous deities, either in their proper form of corn, rice, and so forth, or in the borrowed shapes of animals and men. It remains to show that hunting and pastoral tribes, as well as agricultural peoples, have been in the habit of killing the beings whom they worship. Among the worshipful beings or gods, if indeed they deserve to be dignified by that name, whom hunters and shepherds adore and kill, are animals pure and simple, not animals regarded as embodiments of other supernatural beings. Our first example is drawn from the Indians of California, who, living in a fertile country, under a serene and temperate sky, nevertheless rank near the bottom of the savage scale. The Akagsaman tribe adored the great buzzard, and once a year they celebrated a great festival called Pains, or Bird Feast, in its honor. The day selected for the festival was made known to the public on the evening before its celebration, and preparations were at once made for the erection of a special temple, Vanquech, which seems to have been a circular or oval enclosure of stakes, with the stuffed skin of a coyote or prairie wolf set up on a hurdle to represent the god Chinich. When the temple was ready, the bird was carried into it in solemn procession and laid on an altar erected for the purpose. Then all the young women, whether married or single, began to run to and fro, as if distracted, some in one direction and some in another, while the elders of both sexes remained silent spectators of the scene, and the captains, tricked out in paint and feathers, danced round their adored bird. These ceremonies being concluded, they seized upon the bird and carried it to the principal temple, all the assembly uniting in the grand display, and the captains dancing and singing at the head of the procession. Arrived at the temple, they killed the bird without losing a drop of its blood. The skin was removed entire and preserved with the feathers as a relic, or for the purpose of making the festal garment or pelt. The carcass was buried in a hole in the temple, and the old women gathered round the grave, weeping and moaning bitterly, while they threw various kinds of seeds or pieces of food on it, crying out, "Why did you run away? Would you not have been better with us? You would have made pinole," a kind of gruel, "as we do, and if you had not run away, you would not have become a pains," and so on. When this ceremony was concluded, the dancing was resumed and kept up for 3 days and nights. They said that the Pains was a woman who had run off to the mountains, and there been changed into a bird by the god Chinich. They believed that though they sacrificed the bird annually, she came to life again and returned to her home in the mountains. Moreover, they thought that as often as the bird was killed, it became multiplied, because every year all the different capitaines celebrated the same feast of Pains, and were firm in the opinion that the birds sacrificed were but one and the same female. The unity and multiplicity thus postulated by the Californians is very noticeable, and helps to explain their motive for killing the divine bird. The notion of the life of a species as distinct from that of an individual, easy and obvious as it seems to us, appears to be one which the Californian savage cannot grasp. He is unable to conceive the life of the species otherwise than as an individual life, and therefore as exposed to the same dangers and calamities which menace and finally destroy the life of the individual. Apparently, he imagines that a species left to itself will grow old and die like an individual, and that therefore some step must be taken to save from extinction the particular species, which he regards as divine. The only means he can think of to avert the catastrophe is to kill a member of the species in whose veins the tide of life is still running strong, and has not yet stagnated among the fens of old age. The life thus diverted from one channel will flow, he fancies, more freshly and freely in a new one. In other words, the slain animal will revive and enter on a new term of life with all the spring and energy of youth. To us, this reasoning is transparently absurd, but so too is the custom. A similar confusion, it may be noted, between the individual life and the life of the species was made by Samoans. Each family had for its god a particular species of animal, yet the death of one of these animals, for example an owl, was not the death of the god. He was supposed to be yet alive and incarnate in all the owls in existence. Subsection 2. Killing the sacred ram. The rude Californian rite, which we have just considered, has a close parallel in the religion of ancient Egypt. The Thebans and other Egyptians who worshipped the Theban god Ammon held rams to be sacred, and would not sacrifice them. But once a year, at the festival of Ammon, they killed a ram, skinned it, and clothed the image of the god in the skin. Then they mourned over the ram, and buried it in a sacred tomb. The custom was explained by a story that Zeus had once exhibited himself to Hercules, clad in the fleece and wearing the head of a ram. Of course, the ram, in this case, was simply the beast god of Thebes, as the wolf was the beast god of Lycopolis, and the goat was the beast god of Mendes. In other words, the ram was Ammon himself. On the monuments, it is true, Ammon appears in semi-human form, with the body of a man and the head of a ram, but this only shows that he was in the usual chrysalis state, through which beast gods regularly pass before they emerge as full-grown anthropomorphic gods. The ram, therefore, was killed, not as a sacrifice to Ammon, but as the god himself, whose identity with the beast is plainly shown by the custom of clothing his image in the skin of the slain ram. The reason for thus killing the ram god annually may have been that which I have assigned for the general custom of killing a god, and for the special Californian custom of killing the divine buzzard. As applied to Egypt, this explanation is supported by the analogy of the bull god Apis, who was not suffered to outlive a certain term of years. The intention of thus putting a limit to the life of the human god was, as I have argued, to secure him from the weakness and frailty of age. The same reasoning would explain the custom, probably an older one, of putting the beast god to death annually, as was done with the ram of Thebes. One point in the Theban ritual, the application of the skin to the image of the god, deserves particular attention. If the god was at first a living ram, his representation by an image must have originated later. But how did it originate? One answer to this question is perhaps furnished by the practice of preserving the skin of the animal which is slain as divine. The Californians, as we have seen, preserve the skin of the buzzard, and the skin of the goat, which is killed on the harvest field, as a representative of the corn spirit, is kept for various superstitious purposes. The skin, in fact, was kept as a token or memorial of the god, or rather as containing in it a part of the divine life, and it had only to be stuffed or stretched upon a frame to become a regular image of him. At first, an image of this kind would be renewed annually, the new image being provided by the skin of the slain animal. But from annual images to permanent images, the transition is easy. We have seen that the older custom of cutting a new May tree every year was suspended by the practice of maintaining a permanent maypole, which was, however, annually decked with fresh leaves and flowers, and even surmounted each year by a fresh young tree. Similarly, when the stuffed skin, as a representative of the god, was replaced by a permanent image of him in wood, stone, or metal, the permanent image was annually clad in the fresh skin of the slain animal. When this stage had been reached, the custom of killing the ram came naturally to be interpreted as a sacrifice offered to the image, and was explained by a story like that of Ammon and Hercules. Subsection 3. Killing the sacred serpent. West Africa appears to furnish another example of the annual killing of a sacred animal and the preservation of its skin. The people of Issapu, in the island of Fernando Po, regard the cobra capella as their guardian deity, who can do them good or ill, bestow riches, or inflict disease and death. The skin of one of these reptiles is hung tail downwards from a branch of the highest tree in the public square, and the placing of it on the tree is an annual ceremony. As soon as the ceremony is over, all children born within the past year are carried out and their hands made to touch the tail of the serpent's skin. The latter custom is clearly a way of placing the infants under the protection of the tribal god. Similarly, in Senegambia, a python is expected to visit every child of the python clan within 8 days after birth. And the Sili, a snake clan of ancient Africa, used to expose their infants to snakes in the belief that the snakes would not harm true-born children of the clan. Subsection 4. Killing the sacred turtles. In the Californian, Egyptian, and Fernando Po customs, the worship of the animal seems to have no relation to agriculture, and may therefore be presumed to date from the hunting or pastoral stage of society. The same may be said of the following custom, though the Zuni Indians of New Mexico who practice it are now settled in walled villages or towns of a peculiar type, and practice agriculture and the arts of pottery and weaving. But the Zuni custom is marked by certain features which appear to place it in a somewhat different class from the preceding cases. It may be well, therefore, to describe it at full length in the words of an eyewitness. With midsummer, the heat became intense. My brother, i.e. adopted Indian brother, and I sat, day after day, in the cool under rooms of our house, the latter, busy with his quaint forge and crude appliances, working Mexican coins over into bangles, girdles, earrings, buttons, and whatnot for savage ornament. Though his tools were wonderfully rude, the work he turned out by dint of combined patience and ingenuity was remarkably beautiful. One day, as I sat watching him, a procession of 50 men went hastily down the hill and off westward over the plain. They were solemnly led by a painted and shell-bedecked priest, and followed by a torch-bearing Shulu Witsi, or god of fire. After they had vanished, I asked old brother what it all meant. "They are going," said he, "to the city Kaka, and the home of our others." 4 days after, toward sunset, costumed and masked in the beautiful paraphernalia of the kokokshi, or good dance, they returned in file up the same pathway, each bearing in his arms a basket filled with living, squirming turtles, which he regarded and carried as tenderly as a mother would her infant. Some of the wretched reptiles were carefully wrapped in soft blankets, their heads and forefeet protruding, and mounted on the backs of the plume-bedecked pilgrims, made ludicrous but solemn caricatures of little children in the same position. While I was at supper upstairs that evening, the governor's brother-in-law came in. He was welcomed by the family as if a messenger from heaven. He bore in his tremulous fingers one of the much abused and rebellious turtles. Paint still adhered to his hands and bare feet, which led me to infer that he had formed one of the sacred embassy. "So you went to Cath Flu Elon, did you?" I asked. "Yea," replied the weary man in a voice husky with long chanting, as he sank almost exhausted on a roll of skins which had been placed for him, and tenderly laid the turtle on the floor. No sooner did the creature find itself at liberty than it made off as fast as its lame legs could take it. Of one accord, the family forsook dish, spoon, and drinking cup, and grabbing from a sacred meal bowl whole handfuls of the contents, hurriedly followed the turtle about the room, into dark corners, around water jars, behind the grinding troughs, and out into the middle of the floor again, praying and scattering meal on its back as they went. At last, strange to say, it approached the foot-sore man who had brought it. "Ha!" he exclaimed with emotion. "See, it comes to me again. Ah, what great favors the fathers of all grant me this day." And passing his hand gently over the sprawling animal, he inhaled from his palm deeply and long, at the same time invoking the favor of the gods. Then he leaned his chin upon his hand, and with large wistful eyes regarded his ugly captive as it sprawled about, blinking its meal-bedimmed eyes and clawing the smooth floor in memory of its native element. At this juncture I ventured a question. "Why do you not let him go, or give him some water?" Slowly the man turned his eyes toward me, an odd mixture of pain, indignation, and pity on his face, while the worshipful family stared at me with holy horror. "Poor younger brother," he said at last, "know you not how precious it is? It die? It will not die. I tell you, it cannot die." "But it will die if you don't feed it and give it water." "I tell you, it cannot die. It will only change houses tomorrow and go back to the home of its brothers." "Ah, well, how should you know?" he mused, turning to the blinded turtle again. Ah, my poor dear lost child or parent, my sister or brother to have been, who knows which, maybe my own great-grandfather or mother. And with this he fell to weeping almost pathetically, and tremulous with sobs, which were echoed by the women and children, he buried his face in his hands. Filled with sympathy for his grief, however mistaken, I raised the turtle to my lips and kissed its cold shell, then depositing it on the floor, hastily left the grief-stricken family to their sorrows. Next day, with prayers and tender beseechings, plumes and offerings, the poor turtle was killed, and its flesh and bones were removed and deposited in the little river, that it might return once more to eternal life among its comrades in the dark waters of the lake of the dead. The shell, carefully scraped and dried, was made into a dance rattle, and covered by a piece of buckskin. It still hangs from the smoke-stained rafters of my brother's house. Once a Navajo tried to buy it for a ladle, loaded with indignant reproaches. He was turned cud of the house. Were any one to venture the suggestion that the turtle no longer lived, his remark would cause a flood of tears, and he would be reminded that it had only changed houses and gone to live forever in the homes of our lost others. In this custom we find expressed in the clearest way a belief in the transmigration of human souls into the bodies of turtles. The theory of transmigration is held by the Moki Indians, who belong to the same race as the Zunis. The Mokis are divided into totem clans, the Bear Clan, Deer Clan, Wolf Clan, Hare Clan, and so on. They believe that the ancestors of the clans were bears, deer, wolves, hares, and so forth, and that at death the members of each clan become bears, deer, and so on according to the particular clan to which they belonged. The Zuni are also divided into clans, the totems of which agree closely with those of the Mokis, and one of their totems is the turtle. Thus, their belief in transmigration into the turtle is probably one of the regular articles of their totem faith. What, then, is the meaning of killing a turtle in which the soul of a kinsman is believed to be present? Apparently, the object is to keep up a communication with the other world, in which the souls of the departed are believed to be assembled in the form of turtles. It is a common belief that the spirits of the dead return occasionally to their old homes, and accordingly, the unseen visitors are welcomed and feasted by the living, and then sent upon their way. In the Zuni ceremony, the dead are fetched home in the form of turtles, and the killing of the turtles is the way of sending back the souls to the spirit land. Thus, the general explanation given above of the custom of killing a god seems inapplicable to the Zuni custom, the true meaning of which is somewhat obscure. Nor is the obscurity which hangs over the subject entirely dissipated by a later and fuller account which we possess of the ceremony. From it we learn that the ceremony forms part of the elaborate ritual which these Indians observe at the midsummer solstice for the purpose of ensuring an abundant supply of rain for the crops. Envoys are dispatched to bring their other selves, the tortoises, from the sacred lake, Kafluwalawa, to which the souls of the dead are believed to repair. When the creatures have thus been solemnly brought to Zuni, they are placed in a bowl of water, and dances are performed beside them by men in costume, who personate gods and goddesses. After the ceremonial, the tortoises are taken home by those who caught them, and are hung by their necks to the rafters till morning, when they are thrown into pots of boiling water. The eggs are considered a great delicacy. The meat is seldom touched, except as a medicine, which is curative for cutaneous diseases. Part of the meat is deposited in the river with kohakwa, white shell beads, and turquoise beads as offerings to council of the gods. This account, at all events, confirms the inference that the tortoises are supposed to be reincarnations of the human dead, for they are called the other selves of the Zuni. Indeed, what else should they be than the souls of the dead in the bodies of tortoises, seeing that they come from the haunted lake? As the principal object of the prayers uttered and the dances performed at these midsummer ceremonies appears to be to procure rain for the crops, it may be that the intention of bringing the tortoises to Zuni and dancing before them is to intercede with the ancestral spirit incarnate in the animals, that they may be pleased to exert their power over the waters of heaven for the benefit of their living descendants. Subsection 5. Killing the sacred bear. Doubt also hangs at first sight over the meaning of the bear sacrifice offered by the Aino or Ainu, a primitive people who are found in the Japanese island of Yezo or Yeso, as well as in Sakhalin and the southern of the Kurile Islands. It is not quite easy to define the attitude of the Aino towards the bear. On the one hand, they give it the name of kamui, or God, but as they apply the same word to strangers, it may mean no more than a being supposed to be endowed with superhuman or, at all events, extraordinary powers. Again, it is said that the bear is their chief divinity. In the religion of the Aino, the bear plays a chief part. Amongst the animals, it is especially the bear which receives an idolatrous veneration. They worship it after their fashion. There is no doubt that this wild beast inspires more of the feeling which prompts worship than the inanimate forces of nature, and the Aino may be distinguished as bear worshippers. Yet, on the other hand, they kill the bear whenever they can. In bygone years, the Ainu considered bear hunting the most manly and useful way in which a person could possibly spend his time. The men spend the autumn, winter, and spring in hunting deer and bears. Part of their tribute or taxes is paid in skins, and they subsist on the dried meat. Bear's flesh is indeed one of their staple foods. They eat it both fresh and salted, and the skins of bears furnish them with clothing. In fact, the worship of which writers on this subject speak appears to be paid chiefly to the dead animal. Thus, although they kill a bear whenever they can, in the process of dissecting the carcass, they endeavor to conciliate the deity whose representative they have slain by making elaborate obeisances and deprecatory salutations. When a bear has been killed, the Ainu sit down and admire it, make their salams to it, worship it, and offer presents of inao. When a bear is trapped or wounded by an arrow, the hunters go through an apologetic or propitiatory ceremony. The skulls of slain bears receive a place of honor in their huts, or are set up on sacred posts outside the huts and are treated with much respect. Libations of millet beer and of sake and intoxicating liquor are offered to them, and they are addressed as divine preservers or precious divinities. The skulls of foxes are also fastened to the sacred posts outside the huts. They are regarded as charms against evil spirits and are consulted as oracles. Yet it is expressly said the live fox is revered just as little as the bear. Rather, they avoid it as much as possible, considering it a wily animal. The bear can hardly, therefore, be described as a sacred animal of the Aino, nor yet as a totem, for they do not call themselves bears, and they kill and eat the animal freely. However, they have a legend of a woman who had a son by a bear, and many of them who dwell in the mountains pride themselves on being descended from a bear. Such people are called descendants of the bear, Kiminkumui Senekiri, and in the pride of their heart they will say, "As for me, I am a child of the god of the mountains. I am descended from the divine who rules in the mountains," meaning by the god of the mountains, no other than the bear. It is therefore possible that, as our principal authority, the Reverend J. Batchelor, believes the bear may have been the totem of an Aino clan. But even if that were so, it would not explain the respect shown for the animal by the whole Aino people. But it is the bear festival of the Aino which concerns us here. Towards the end of winter, a bear cub is caught and brought into the village. If it is very small, it is suckled by an Aino woman. But should there be no woman able to suckle it, the little animal is fed from the hand or the mouth. During the day, it plays about in the hut with the children and is treated with great affection. But when the cub grows big enough to pain people by hugging or scratching them, he is shut up in a strong wooden cage, where he stays generally for 2 or 3 years, fed on fish and millet porridge, till it is time for him to be killed and eaten. But it is a peculiarly striking fact that the young bear is not kept merely to furnish a good meal. Rather, he is regarded and honored as a fetish, or even as a sort of higher being. In Yezo, the festival is generally celebrated in September or October. Before it takes place, the Aino apologize to their gods, alleging that they have treated the bear kindly as long as they could. Now they can feed him no longer and are obliged to kill him. A man who gives a bear feast invites his relations and friends. In a small village, nearly the whole community takes part in the feast. Indeed, guests from distant villages are invited and generally come, allured by the prospect of getting drunk for nothing. The form of invitation runs somewhat as follows: "I, so-and-so, am about to sacrifice the dear little divine thing who resides among the mountains. My friends and masters, come ye to the feast. We will then reunite in the great pleasure of sending the god away. Come." When all the people are assembled in front of the cage, an orator, chosen for the purpose, addresses the bear and tells it that they are about to send it forth to its ancestors. He craves pardon for what they are about to do to it, hopes it will not be angry, and comforts it by assuring the animal that many of the sacred whittled sticks, ineo, and plenty of cakes and wine will be sent with it on the long journey. One speech of this sort, with Mr. Bachelor, heard ran as follows. O thou divine one, thou wast sent into the world for us to hunt. O thou precious little divinity, we worship thee, pray hear our prayer. We have nourished thee and brought thee up with a deal of pains and trouble, all because we love thee so. Now, as thou hast grown big, we are about to send thee to thy father and mother. When thou comest to them, please speak well of us, and tell them how kind we have been. Please come to us again, and we will sacrifice thee. Having been secured with ropes, the bear is then let out of the cage and assailed with a shower of blunt arrows in order to arouse it to fury. When it has spent itself in vain struggles, it is tied up to a stake, gagged and strangled, its neck being placed between two poles, which are then violently compressed, all the people eagerly helping to squeeze the animal to death. An arrow is also discharged into the beast's heart by a good marksman, but so as not to shed blood, for they think that it would be very unlucky if any of the blood were to drip on the ground. However, the men sometimes drink the warm blood of the bear, that the courage and other virtues it possesses may pass into them, and sometimes they besmear themselves and their clothes with the blood in order to ensure success in hunting. When the animal has been strangled to death, it is skinned and its head is cut off and set in the east window of the house, where a piece of its own flesh is placed under its snout, together with a cup of its own meat boiled, some millet dumplings, and dried fish. Prayers are then addressed to the dead animal. Amongst other things, it is sometimes invited, after going away to its father and mother, to return into the world in order that it may again be reared for sacrifice. When the bear is supposed to have finished eating its own flesh, the man who presides at the feast takes the cup containing the boiled meat, salutes it, and divides the contents between all the company present. Every person, young and old alike, must taste a little. The cup is called the cup of offering, because it has just been offered to the dead bear. When the rest of the flesh has been cooked, it is shared out in like manner among all the people, everybody partaking of at least a morsel. Not to partake of the feast would be equivalent to excommunication. It would be to place the recreant outside the pale of Aino fellowship. Formerly, every particle of the bear, except the bones, had to be eaten up at the banquet, but this rule is now relaxed. The head, on being detached from the skin, is set up on a long pole beside the sacred wands, ineo, outside of the house, where it remains till nothing but the bare white skull is left. Skulls so set up are worshipped, not only at the time of the festival, but very often as long as they last. The Aino assured Mr. Bachelor that they really do believe the spirit of the worshipful animals to reside in the skulls. That is why they address them as divine preservers and precious divinities. The ceremony of killing the bear was witnessed by Dr. B. Shobe on the 10th of August in Kunui, which is a village on Volcano Bay in the island of Yezo or Yeso. As his description of the rite contains some interesting particulars not mentioned in the foregoing account, it may be worthwhile to summarize it. On entering the hut, he found about 30 Aino present, men, women, and children, all dressed in their best. The master of the house first offered a libation on the fireplace to the god of the fire, and the guests followed his example. Then a libation was offered to the house god in his sacred corner of the hut. Meanwhile, the housewife, who had nursed the bear, sat by herself, silent and sad, bursting now and then into tears. Her grief was obviously unaffected, and it deepened as the festival went on. Next, the master of the house and some of the guests went out of the hut and offered libations before the bear's cage. A few drops were presented to the bear in a saucer, which he at once upset. Then the women and girls danced round the cage, their faces turned towards it, their knees slightly bent, rising and hopping on their toes. As they danced, they clapped their hands and sang a monotonous song. The housewife and a few old women, who might have nursed many bears, danced tearfully, stretching out their arms to the bear and addressing it in terms of endearment. The young folks were less affected. They laughed as well as sang. Disturbed by the noise, the bear began to rush about his cage and howl lamentably. Next libations were offered to the inabos, or sacred wands, which stand outside of an Aino hut. These wands are about a couple of feet high and are whittled at the top into spiral shavings. 5 new wands with bamboo leaves attached to them had been set up for the festival. This is regularly done when a bear is killed. The leaves mean that the animal may come to life again. Then the bear was let out of the cage, a rope was thrown round his neck, and he was led about in the neighborhood of the hut. While this was being done, the men, headed by a chief, shot at the beast with arrows tipped with wooden buttons. Dr. Schaub had to do so also. Then the bear was taken before the sacred wands. A stick was put in his mouth. 9 men knelt on him and pressed his neck against a beam. In 5 minutes, the animal had expired without uttering a sound. Meantime, the women and girls had taken post behind the men, where they danced, lamenting and beating the men who were killing the bear. The bear's carcass was next placed on the mat before the sacred wands, and a sword and quiver, taken from the wands, were hung round the beast's neck. Being a she-bear, it was also adorned with a necklace and earrings. Then food and drink were offered to it in the shape of millet broth, millet cakes, and a pot of sake. The men now sat down on mats before the dead bear, offered libations to it, and drank deep. Meanwhile, the women and girls had laid aside all marks of sorrow, and danced merrily, none more merrily than the old women. When the mirth was at its height, 2 young Aino, who had let the bear out of his cage, mounted the roof of the hut and threw cakes of millet among the company, who all scrambled for them without distinction of age or sex. The bear was next skinned and disemboweled, and the trunk severed from the head, to which the skin was left hanging. The blood, caught in cups, was eagerly swallowed by the men. None of the women or children appeared to drink the blood, though custom did not forbid them to do so. The liver was cut in small pieces and eaten raw with salt, the women and children getting their share. The flesh and the rest of the vitals were taken into the house to be kept till the next day but one, and then to be divided among the persons who had been present at the feast. Blood and liver were offered to Dr. Schaub. While the bear was being disemboweled, the women and girls danced the same dance, which they had danced at the beginning, not, however, round the cage, but in front of the sacred wands. At this dance, the old women, who had been merry a moment before, again shed tears freely. After the brain had been extracted from the bear's head and swallowed with salt, the skull, detached from the skin, was hung on a pole beside the sacred wands. The stick with which the bear had been gagged was also fastened to the pole, and so were the sword and quiver, which had been hung on the carcass. The latter were removed in about an hour, but the rest remained standing. The whole company, men and women, danced noisily before the pole, and another drinking bout, in which the women joined, closed the festival. Perhaps the first published account of the bear feast of the Aino is one which was given to the world by a Japanese writer in 1652. It has been translated into French and runs thus: When they find a young bear, they bring it home, and the wife suckles it. When it is grown, they feed it with fish and fowl, and kill it in winter for the sake of the liver, which they esteem an antidote to poison, the worms, colic, and disorders of the stomach. It is of a very bitter taste, and is good for nothing if the bear has been killed in summer. This butchery begins in the first Japanese month. For this purpose, they put the animal's head between 2 long poles, which are squeezed together by 50 or 60 people, both men and women. When the bear is dead, they eat his flesh, keep the liver as a medicine, and sell the skin, which is black and commonly 6 feet long, but the longest measure 12 feet. As soon as he is skinned, the persons who nourish the beast begin to bewail him. Afterwards, they make little cakes to regale those who helped them. The Aino of Sakhalin rear bear cubs and kill them with similar ceremonies. We are told that they do not look upon the bear as a god, but only as a messenger, whom they dispatch with various commissions to the god of the forest. The animal is kept for about 2 years in a cage, and then killed at a festival, which always takes place in winter and at night. The day before the sacrifice is devoted to lamentation, old women relieving each other in their duty of weeping and groaning in front of the bear's cage. Then, about the middle of the night, or very early in the morning, an orator makes a long speech to the beast, reminding him how they have taken care of him, and fed him well, and bathed him in the river, and made him warm and comfortable. Now, he proceeds, we are holding a great festival in your honor. Be not afraid, we will not hurt you. We will only kill you and send you to the god of the forest who loves you. We are about to offer you a good dinner, the best you have ever eaten among us, and we will all weep for you together. The Aino who will kill you is the best shot among us. There he is. He weeps and asks your forgiveness. You will feel almost nothing. It will be done so quickly. We cannot feed you always, as you will understand. We have done enough for you. It is now your turn to sacrifice yourself for us. You will ask God to send us for the winter plenty of otters and sables, and for the summer seals and fish in abundance. Do not forget our messages. We love you much, and our children will never forget you. When the bear has partaken of his last meal, amid the general emotion of the spectators, the old women weeping afresh, and the men uttering stifled cries, he is strapped not without difficulty and danger, and being let out of the cage is led on leash or dragged, according to the state of his temper, thrice round his cage, then round his master's house, and lastly round the house of the orator. Thereupon he is tied up to a tree, which is decked with sacred whittled sticks and nail of the usual sort, and the orator again addresses him in a long harangue, which sometimes lasts till the day is beginning to break. Remember, he cries, remember, I remind you of your whole life and of the services we have rendered you. It is now for you to do your duty. Do not forget what I have asked of you. You will tell the gods to give us riches, that our hunters may return from the forest laden with rare furs and animals good to eat, that our fishers may find troops of seals on the shore and in the sea, and that their nets may crack under the weight of the fish. We have no hope but in you. The evil spirits laugh at us, and too often they are unfavorable and malign to us, but they will bow before you. We have given you food and joy and health. Now we kill you in order that you may in return send riches to us and to our children. To this discourse the bear, more and more surly and agitated, listens without conviction. Round and round the tree he paces and howls lamentably, till, just as the first beams of the rising sun light up the scene, an archer speeds an arrow to his heart. No sooner has he done so than the marksman throws away his bow and flings himself on the ground, and the old men and women do the same, weeping and sobbing. Then they offer the dead beast a repast of rice and wild potatoes, and having spoken to him in terms of pity, and thanked him for what he has done and suffered, they cut off his head and paws and keep them as sacred things. A banquet on the flesh and blood of their bear follows. Women were formerly excluded from it, but now they share with the men. The blood is drunk, warm by all present. The flesh is boiled. Custom forbids it to be roasted, and as the relics of the bear may not enter the house by the door, and Aino houses in Sakhalin have no windows, a man gets up on the roof and lets the flesh, the head, and the skin down through the smoke hole. Rice and wild potatoes are then offered to the head, and a pipe, tobacco, and matches are considerately placed beside it. Custom requires that the guests should eat up the whole animal before they depart. The use of salt and pepper at the meal is forbidden, and no morsel of the flesh may be given to the dogs. When the banquet is over, the head is carried away into the depth of the forest and deposited on a heap of bears' skulls and bleached and moldering relics of similar festivals in the past. The Gilyaks, a Tungusian people of eastern Siberia, hold a bear festival of the same sort once a year in January. The bear is the object of the most refined solicitude of an entire village, and plays the chief part in their religious ceremonies. An old she-bear is shot and her cub is reared, but not suckled in the village. When the bear is big enough, he is taken from his cage and dragged through the village, but first they lead him to the bank of the river, for this is believed to ensure abundance of fish to each family. He is then taken into every house in the village, where fish, brandy, and so forth are offered to him. Some people prostrate themselves before the beast. His entrance into a house is supposed to bring a blessing, and if he snuffs at the food offered to him, this also is a blessing. Nevertheless, they tease and worry, poke and tickle the animal continually, so that he is surly and snappish. After being thus taken to every house, he is tied to a peg and shot dead with arrows. His head is then cut off, decked with shavings, and placed on the table where the feast is set out. Here they beg pardon of the beast and worship him. Then his flesh is roasted and eaten in special vessels of wood finely carved. They do not eat the flesh raw, nor drink the blood, as the Aino do. The brain and entrails are eaten last, and the skull, still decked with shavings, is placed on a tree near the house. Then the people sing, and both sexes dance in ranks as bears. One of these bear festivals was witnessed by the Russian traveler L. von Schrenck and his companions at the Gilyak village of Tabak in January 1856. From his detailed report of the ceremony, we may gather some particulars which are not noticed in the briefer accounts which I have just summarized. The bear, he tells us, plays a great part in the life of all the peoples inhabiting the region of the Amur and Siberia as far as Kamchatka, but among none of them is his importance greater than among the Gilyaks. The immense size which the animal attains in the valley of the Amur, his ferocity whetted by hunger, and the frequency of his appearance, all combine to make him the most dreaded beast of prey in the country. No wonder, therefore, that the fancy of the Gilyaks is busied with him and surrounds him, both in life and in death, with a sort of halo of superstitious fear. Thus, for example, it is thought that if a Gilyak falls in combat with a bear, his soul transmigrates into the body of the beast. Nevertheless, his flesh is an irresistible attraction for the Gilyak palate. especially when the animal has been kept in captivity for some time and fattened on fish, which gives the flesh, in the opinion of the Gilyaks, a peculiarly delicious flavor. But in order to enjoy this dainty with impunity, they deem it needful to perform a long series of ceremonies, of which the intention is to delude the living bear by a show of respect, and to appease the anger of the dead animal by the homage paid to his departed spirit. The marks of respect begin as soon as the beast is captured. He is brought home in triumph and kept in a cage where all the villagers take it in turns to feed him. For although he may have been captured or purchased by one man, he belongs in a manner to the whole village. His flesh will furnish a common feast, and hence all must contribute to support him in his life. The length of time he is kept in captivity depends on his age. Old bears are kept only a few months, cubs are kept till they are full grown. A thick layer of fat on the captive bear gives a signal for the festival, which is always held in winter, generally in December, but sometimes in January or February. At the festival witnessed by the Russian travelers, which lasted a good many days, 3 bears were killed and eaten. More than once the animals were led about in procession and compelled to enter every house in the village, where they were fed as a mark of honor, and to show that they were welcome guests. But before the beasts set out on this round of visits, the Gilyaks played at skipping rope in presence, and perhaps, as Elvan Schrenk inclined to believe, in honor of the animals. The night before they were killed, the 3 bears were led by moonlight a long way on the ice of the frozen river. That night no one in the village might sleep. Next day, after the animals had been again led down the steep bank to the river and conducted thrice round the hole in the ice from which the women of the village drew their water, they were taken to an appointed place not far from the village and shot to death with arrows. The place of sacrifice or execution was marked as holy by being surrounded with whittled sticks, from the tops of which shavings hung in curls. Such sticks were with the Gilyaks as with the Aino, the regular symbols that accompany all religious ceremonies. When the house has been arranged and decorated for the reception, the skins of the bears, with their heads attached to them, are brought into it, not, however, by the door, but through a window, and then hung on a sort of scaffold opposite the hearth, on which the flesh is to be cooked. The boiling of the bear's flesh among the Gilyaks is done only by the oldest men, whose high privilege it is. Women and children, young men and boys, have no part in it. The task is performed slowly and deliberately, with a certain solemnity. On the occasion described by the Russian travelers, the kettle was first of all surrounded with a thick wreath of shavings, and then filled with snow, for the use of water to cook bear's flesh is forbidden. Meanwhile, a large wooden trough, richly adorned with arabesques and carvings of all sorts, was hung immediately under the snouts of the bears. On the side of the trough was carved in relief a bear, on the other side a toad. When the carcasses were being cut up, each leg was laid on the ground in front of the bears, as if to ask their leave, before being placed in the kettle, and the boiled flesh was fished out of the kettle with an iron hook, and set in the trough before the bears, in order that they might be the first to taste of their own flesh. As fast, too, as the fat was cut in strips, it was hung up in front of the bears, and afterwards laid in a small wooden trough on the ground before them. Last of all, the inner organs of the beasts were cut up and placed in small vessels. At the same time, the women made bandages out of party-colored rags, and after sunset, these bandages were tied round the bears' snouts, just below the eyes, in order to dry the tears that flowed from them. As soon as the ceremony of wiping away poor Bruin's tears had been performed, the assembled Gilyaks set to work in earnest to devour his flesh. The broth obtained by boiling the meat had already been partaken of. The wooden bowls, platters, and spoons out of which the Gilyaks eat the broth and flesh of the bears on these occasions are always made specially for the purpose at the festival, and only then. They are elaborately ornamented with carved figures of bears and other devices that refer to the animal or the festival, and the people have a strong superstitious scruple against parting with them. After the bones had been picked clean, they were put back in the kettle in which the flesh had been boiled. And when the festal meal was over, an old man took his stand at the door of the house with a branch of fir in his hand, with which, as the people passed out, he gave a light blow to everyone who had eaten of the bear's flesh or fat, perhaps as a punishment for their treatment of the worshipful animal. In the afternoon, the women performed a strange dance. Only one woman danced at a time, throwing the upper part of her body into the oldest postures, while she held in her hands a branch of fir or a kind of wooden castanets. The other woman, meanwhile, played an accompaniment by drumming on the beams of the house with clubs. Von Schrenck believed that after the flesh of the bear has been eaten, the bones and the skull are solemnly carried out by the oldest people to a place in the forest not far from the village. There all the bones except the skull are buried. After that a young tree is felled a few inches above the ground, its stump cleft, and the skull wedged into the cleft. When the grass grows over the spot, the skull disappears from view, and that is the end of the bear. Another description of the bear festivals of the Gileacs has been given to us by Mr. Leo Sternberg. It agrees substantially with the foregoing accounts, but a few particulars in it may be noted. According to Mr. Sternberg, the festival is usually held in honor of a deceased relation. The next of kin either buys or catches a bear and nurtures it for 2 or 3 years, till it is ready for the sacrifice. Only certain distinguished guests, nark-gen, are privileged to take part of the year's flesh, but the host and members of his clan eat a broth made from the flesh. Great quantities of this broth are prepared and consumed on the occasion. The guest of honor, nark-en, must belong to the clan into which the host's daughters and the other women of his clan are married. One of these guests, usually the host's son-in-law, is entrusted with the duty of shooting the bear dead with an arrow. The skin, head, and flesh of the slain bear are brought into the house, not through the door, but through the smoke hole. A quiver full of arrows is laid under the head, and beside it are deposited tobacco, sugar, and other food. The soul of the bear is supposed to carry off the souls of these things with it on the far journey. A special vessel is used for cooking the bear's flesh, and the fire must be kindled by a sacred apparatus of flint and steel, which belongs to the clan and is handed down from generation to generation, but which is never used to light fires except on these solemn occasions. Of all the many viands cooked for the consumption of the assembled people, a portion is placed in a special vessel and set before the bear's head. This is called feeding the head. After the bear has been killed, dogs are sacrificed in couples of male and female. Before being throttled, they are fed and invited to go to their lord on the highest mountain, to change their skins, and to return next year in the form of bears. The soul of the dead bear departs to the same lord, who is also lord of the primeval forest. It goes away laden with the offerings that have been made to it, and attended by the souls of the dogs, and also by the souls of the sacred whittled sticks, which figure prominently at the festival. The Goldie, neighbors of the Gileacs, treat the bear in much the same way. They hunt and kill it, but sometimes they capture a live bear and keep him in a cage, feeding him well and calling him their son and brother. Then, at a great festival, he is taken from his cage, paraded about with marked consideration, and afterwards killed and eaten. The skull, jawbones, and ears are then suspended on a tree as an antidote against evil spirits. But the flesh is eaten, and much relished, for they believe that all who partake of it acquire a zest for the chase and become courageous. The Huaraches, another Tungusian people of the region of the Amur, hold bear festivals of the same general character. Anyone who catches a bear cub considers it his bounden duty to rear it in a cage for about 3 years, in order, at the end of that time, to kill it publicly and eat the flesh with his friends. The feast being public, though organized by individuals, the people try to have one in each Huarache village every year in turn. When the bear is taken out of his cage, he is led about by means of ropes to all the huts, accompanied by people armed with lances, bows, and arrows. At each hut, the bear and bear leaders are treated to something good to eat and drink. This goes on for several days, until all the huts, not only in the village, but also in the next, have been visited. The days are given up to sport and noisy jollity. Then the bear is tied to a tree or wooden pillar and shot to death by the arrows of the crowd, after which its flesh is roasted and eaten. Among the Huaraches of the Tunja River, women take part of the bear feast, while among the Huaraches of the River Vai, the women will not even touch bear's flesh. In the treatments of the captive bear of these tribes, there are features which can hardly be distinguished from worship. Such, for example, are the prayers offered to it, both alive and dead, the offerings of food, including portions of its own flesh, laid before the animal's skull, and the Gilead custom of leading the living beast to the river in order to ensure a supply of fish, and of conducting him from house to house in order that every family may receive his blessing, just as in Europe a May-tree, or a personal representative of the tree spirit, used to be taken from door to door in spring for the sake of diffusing among all and sundry the fresh energies of reviving nature. Again, the solemn participation in his flesh and blood, and particularly the Aino custom of sharing the contents of the cup, which had been consecrated by being set before the dead beast, are strongly suggestive of a sacrament, and the suggestion is confirmed by the Gilyak practice of reserving special vessels to hold the flesh and cooking it on a fire kindled by a sacred apparatus, which is never employed except on these religious occasions. Indeed, our principal authority on Aino religion, the Rev. John Batchelor, frankly describes as worship the ceremonious respect which the Aino pay to the bear, and he affirms that the animal is undoubtedly one of their gods. Certainly the Aino appear to apply their name for god, Kamui, freely to the bear. But as Mr. Batchelor himself points out, that word is used with many different shades of meaning and is applied to a great variety of objects, so that from its application to the bear, we cannot safely argue that the animal is actually regarded as a deity. Indeed, we are expressly told that the Aino of Sakhalin do not consider the bear to be a god, but only a messenger to the gods, and the message with which they charge the animal at its death bears out the statement. Apparently the Gilyaks also look on the bear in the light of an envoy dispatched with presents to the lord of the mountain, on whom the welfare of the people depends. At the same time, they treat the animal as a being of a higher order than man, in fact, as a minor deity whose presence in the village, so long as he is kept and fed, diffuses blessings, especially by keeping at bay the swarms of evil spirits who are constantly lying in wait for people, stealing their goods and destroying their bodies by sickness and disease. Moreover, by partaking of the flesh, blood, or broth of the bear, the Gilyaks, the Aino, and the Goldie are all of opinion that they acquire some portion of the animal's mighty powers, particularly his courage and strength. No wonder, therefore, that they should treat so great a benefactor with marks of the highest respect and affection. Some light may be thrown on the ambiguous attitude of the Aino to bears by comparing the similar treatment which they accord to other creatures. For example, they regard the eagle owl as a good deity, who, by his hooting, warns men of threatened evil, and defends them against it. Hence, he is loved, trusted, and devoutly worshipped as a divine mediator between men and the Creator. The various names applied to him are significant both of his divinity and of his mediatorship. Whenever an opportunity offers, one of these divine birds is captured and kept in a cage, where he is greeted with the endearing titles of beloved God and dear little divinity. Nevertheless, the time comes when the dear little divinity is throttled and sent away in his capacity of mediator to take a message to the superior gods or to the creature himself. The following is the form of prayer addressed to the eagle owl when it is about to be sacrificed. Beloved deity, we have brought you up because we loved you, and now we are about to send you to your father. We herewith offer you food, and neo, wine, and cakes. Take them to your parent, and he will be very pleased. When you come to him, say, I have lived a long time among the Ainu, where an Ainu father and an Ainu mother reared me. I now come to thee. I have brought a variety of good things. I saw while living in Ainu land a great deal of distress. I observed that some of the people were possessed by demons, some were wounded by wild animals, some were hurt by landslides, others suffered shipwreck, and many were attacked by disease. The people are in great straits. My father, hear me, and hasten to look upon the Ainu and help them. If you do this, your father will help us. Again, the Aino keep eagles in cages, worship them as divinities, and ask them to defend the people from evil. Yet they offer the bird in sacrifice, and when they are about to do so, they pray to him, saying, O precious divinity, O thou divine bird, pray listen to my words. Thou dost not belong to this world, for thy home is with the Creator and his golden eagles. This being so, I present thee with these ineo, and cakes, and other precious things. Do thou ride upon the ineo, and descend to thy home in the glorious heavens. When thou arrivest, assemble the deities of thy own kind together, and thank them for us for having governed the world. Do thou come again, I beseech thee, and rule over us. O my precious one, go thou quietly. Once more, the Aino revere hawks, keep them in cages, and offer them in sacrifice. At the time of killing one of them, the following prayer should be addressed to the bird. O divine hawk, thou art an expert hunter. Please cause thy cleverness to descend on me. If a hawk is well treated in captivity and prayed to after this fashion, when he is about to be killed, he will surely send help to the hunter. Thus the Aino hopes to profit in various ways by slaughtering the creatures, which nevertheless he treats as divine. He He expects them to carry messages for him to their kindred or to the gods in the upper world. He hopes to partake of their virtues by swallowing parts of their bodies or in other ways, and apparently he looks forward to their bodily resurrection in this world, which will enable him again to catch and kill them, and again to reap all the benefits which he has already derived from their slaughter. For in the prayers addressed to the worshipful bear and the worshipful eagle, before they are knocked on the head, the creature are invited to come again, which seems clearly to point to a faith in their future resurrection. If any doubt could exist on this head, it would be dispelled by the evidence of Mr. Batchelor, who tells us that the Aino are firmly convinced that the spirits of the birds and animals killed in hunting or offered in sacrifice come and live again upon the earth clothed with a body, and they believe further that they appear here for the special benefit of men, particularly Ainu hunters. The Aino, Mr. Batchelor tells us, confessedly slays and eats the beast, that another may come in its place and be treated in like manner. And at the time of the sacrificing, the creatures' prayers are said to them, which form a request that they will come again and furnish viands for another feast, as if it were an honor to them to be thus killed and eaten, and a pleasure as well. Indeed, such is the people's idea. These last observations, as the context shows, refer especially to the sacrifice of bears. Thus, among the benefits which the Aino anticipates from the slaughter of the worshipful animals, not the least substantial is that of gorging himself on their flesh and blood, both on the present and on many a similar occasion hereafter, and that pleasing prospect again is derived from his firm faith in the spiritual immortality and bodily resurrection of the dead animals. A like faith is shared by many savage hunters in many parts of the world, and has given rise to a variety of quaint customs, some of which will be described presently. Meantime, it is not unimportant to observe that the solemn festivals at which the Aino, the Gilyaks, and other tribes slaughter the tame caged bears with demonstrations of respect and sorrow are probably nothing but an extension or glorification of similar rites which the hunter performs over any wild bear which he chances to kill in the forest. Indeed, with regard to the Gilyaks, we are expressly informed that this is the case. If we would understand the meaning of the Gilyak ritual, says Mr. Sternberg, we must above all remember that the bear festivals are not, as is usually but falsely assumed, celebrated only at the killing of a house bear, but are held on every occasion when a Gilyak succeeds in slaughtering a bear in the chase. It is true that in such cases the festival assumes less imposing dimensions, but in its essence it remains the same. When the head and skin of a bear killed in the forest are brought into the village, they are accorded a triumphal reception with music and solemn ceremonial. The head is laid on a consecrated scaffold, fed and treated with offerings. Just as the killing of a house bear and the guest of honor, Naraknen, are also assembled, so too dogs are sacrificed, and the bones of the bear are preserved in the same place, and with the same marks of respect as the bones of a house bear. Hence, the great winter festival is only an extension of the rite which is observed at the slaughter of every bear. Thus, the apparent contradiction in the practice of these tribes, who venerate and almost deify the animals which they habitually hunt, kill, and eat, is not so flagrant as at first sight it appears to us. The people have reasons, and some very practical reasons, for acting as they do. For the savage is by no means so illogical and unpractical as to superficial observers is apt to seem. He has thought deeply on the questions which immediately concern him. He reasons about them, and though his conclusions often diverge very widely from ours, we ought not to deny him the credit of patient and prolonged mediation on some fundamental problems of human existence. In the present case, if he treats bears in general as creatures wholly subservient to human needs, and yet singles out certain individuals of the species for homage, which almost amounts to deification, we must not hastily set him down as irrational and inconsistent, but must endeavor to place ourselves at his point of view, to see things as he sees them, and to divest ourselves of the prepossessions which tinge so deeply our own views of the world. If we do so, we shall probably discover that, however absurd this conduct may appear to us, the savage, nevertheless, generally acts on a train of reasoning which seems to him in harmony with the facts of his limited experience. This I propose to illustrate in the following chapter, where I shall attempt to show that the solemn ceremonial of the bear festival among the Ainos and other tribes of northeastern Asia is only a particularly striking example of the respect which, on the principles of his rude philosophy, the savage habitually pays to the animals which he kills and eats. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Midwest Covencast Presents Weekend Reads. We will be back in 2 weeks with our next installment. In the meantime, you can catch up with our other pod, Midwest Covencast. Consider supporting Midwest Covencast and Weekend Reads on our Patreon to gain access to additional content and exclusive Coven merch. You can even join our Coven by following us on social media at Midwest Covencast on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram, and at Midwest Coven on Twitter. You can also keep up with us on our website, MidwestCovencast.com. Until next time, Coven, blessed be.